And please join us for refreshments and conversation in the narthex, the lobby. Committee of 100 members are identified by badges that you'll see us wearing, and we invite you to talk with me and any of the other members here today to learn more about our organization. We welcome new members. And we hope to see you back here at our next event, which is Planning for Industrial Neighbors, Trash Transfer Stations, Utilities, and Bus Garages on Thursday evening, April 13th from 6:30 to 8 p.m. Shelley Repp, chair of the Committee of 100, will be our moderator today. He retired at the end of last year after nearly 50 years in higher education finance. Shelley is a longstanding civic activist, serving in the past as president of the Woolly Mammoth Theater Company, and today is a forceful voice in the future development of his neighborhood of American University Park. For today's event, we're honored to have 4 distinguished speakers who represent 3 important perspectives on climate: scientific research, civil society, and government, to address the present and future challenges of climate change for our city. A way too brief biography of each one is in your program, with the exception of our 4th speaker, who I'll get to in a minute. We've had a last-minute change. Also in your program is an insert concerning the Lights Out DC program that we are signatory to and that we hope you will consider supporting. Dr. Pershing.
Hello.
Dr. Pershing, we are very pleased that you can be with us today via Zoom, and we appreciate your rescheduling of your plans in order to join us. Dr. Andy Pershing is the Director of Climate Science at Climate Central in New Jersey. For those of us landlubbers who do not regularly don a wetsuit, investigate the depths of the Northwest Atlantic Ocean, and analyze findings, we thank you. Welcome to our dry auditorium and to this discussion of how to keep our city sufficiently dry and cool in the coming years. And in a moment here, I'll turn it over to Dr. Pershing and point out that each of our 4 speakers will speak for about 10, 12 minutes in turn. Then I'll introduce the next speaker, and we have a timekeeper who will indicate when you're close to the end of your time. Dr. Pershing, please.
All right. Let's see. Okay, are you seeing the screen? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be able to talk to you. I'm sorry I can't be there in person. Very quickly, I work for Climate Central. We're based in Princeton, New Jersey. We're a climate science, research, and communications NGO. We practice climate science, journalism, and communications, and we have people on our team who are specialists in all of these things. We are nonpartisan, non-advocacy, and we're policy and technology neutral. So these are key aspects to our work. So I want to start just with a graph here that is showing the spring warming trend in Washington, D.C. So it probably doesn't feel like it today. It's a little on the cool side in the Northeast today. But your springs have been warming about 1.9 degrees Fahrenheit since the 1970s. And you can see that any one year you're gonna, you can have some particularly warm years like 2012. You could have years that might be a little cool like 2005. But overall, year after year, we see this persistent warming trend, very typical throughout the country. But it has effect. And so I imagine some of you are allergy sufferers. And if you are wondering why your allergies are getting worse, this is part of the story. Climate change is adding to the number of days where plants can produce pollen, and so making the allergy season longer. And all of the extra CO2 that humans have put into the atmosphere actually make the plants more vigorous, and they produce more pollen. So it makes allergies even more intense. But it's not just temperature. Water is an important part of the climate cycle. And one of the relationships that's very well known in climate science is that the warmer the air is, the more water vapor it can hold. And so that means that as our planet's warming up, you have a greater potential for big rain events, in some ways like what we're seeing on the West Coast today. But in Washington, D.C., the intensity of rainfall has been increasing over time since the 1970s. And I expect that's probably something that many of you have noted. So these changes, though, I've been talking about looking at the past, right? Looking over the last, 50 or so years. we can actually look at the future, and that's what I want to talk about. So this is my cat Bembe helping me look at the future, and we do that with climate models. Climate models are a fantastic resource. They're amazingly good at telling us, giving us a sense for where the world is headed, but also they give us a sense for the choices that we face. So the graph here shows the potential warming. This is now the annual average temperature in Washington, D.C. So you can see you've experienced over 2 degrees change since 1970. We expect to see about another 2 degrees of change going out through 2050. And that's when things get interesting, because that's where you see the choices that we're talking about today really starting to make a difference. So if we continue on our high CO2 trajectory, you could end up with the end of the century having conditions where, where Washington, D.C. really feels a lot like Texas, a lot like, places in the Caribbean, very, very different temperature climate than what you have right now. Whereas if we have significant cuts, Washington, D.C. is going to feel more like an East Coast climate, a little, more like the South Carolina, perhaps by 2050. Another thing I want to point out, and I'll come back to this, is notice how stable the climate is in 2050 under the significant cuts. So I've been talking about temperature, which is an important part of the climate story. But sea level rise is also a very important part, especially for a city like Washington, D.C. that is so connected to the water. So the red regions here are areas that we expect to see encountering more frequent flooding. Pretty much now, I expect that if you went to some of these places that, the people who are living there would have some experience with that. And as you move on to the future, 2050, those areas begin to expand. 2070, they expand even more. But I want to come back to this choice graph, and that's because one of the challenges with sea level rise is, unlike temperature, sea level rise responds much on a much slower time scale than the atmosphere does. So even in the situation where we stabilize climate by 2050, which is the goal that we have with things like the Paris Agreement, ice sheets, glaciers take a much longer time to adjust to those temperatures. And so it could be several decades and more likely centuries before all of the impact of that warming has been felt in terms of sea level rise. So the way we think about it is that we have already experienced about a foot of sea level rise in most of the East Coast. We expect to get about another 5 feet just due to the warming that we've had. And so this won't be necessarily by 2050. This may be by end of century. But that's if we were to stop emitting carbon today, we would get another 5 feet just due to the warming, the 2-4 degrees that we've already put into the climate system. If we make those significant cuts, that allows us to limit warming to or sea level rise to another 3 feet. But if we don't make those significant cuts, then we end up with a situation where we may have up to 11 feet added on top of all of this for 20 feet in total, which is just a really radical change to the coastlines around the world. So in Washington, D.C., you can use our tools to actually see the difference in those choices. So the blue regions are the areas that are inundated. If we limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, which is the Paris Climate Agreement goal, if we blow past that and go to 3 degrees, you can see how much more of the area around the city starts to feel the water. But it's easier to see this and so we did these photorealistic renderings. So this is the Lincoln Memorial. You can see with today's sea level rise of about 1 foot, the sea level rise that's baked in that we cannot avoid because of the warming that we've already induced on the planet will give us about 5 feet of sea level rise. You can see how the water starting to get a little closer. 1.5 degrees of warming, right? Basically about an additional 0.3 degrees C. You start to see water coming in around through the National Mall up onto the steps of the monument. And then if we're looking at that very high CO2, very warm 3 degrees C world, you see just how radically different the city will look under those situations. Just a few others. Here's mid-century, the 1.5 degree global warming, looking at the capital. If we blow past that, go to that high warming scenario, much of the mall becomes underwater. And opening day is coming up. Opening day right now, not a big threat of water coming in and interfering with people getting to the ballpark. with the warming that we've already put into the system, we will eventually start to see some of the parking lots get have some issues with water. Excuse me, 1.5 degrees. Now we're starting to see, a little bit more. And then with 20 feet of warming, right, which is what we could get with 3 degrees C. And again, this wouldn't be immediate. This would be, in potentially a couple hundred years. You can see that there's a lot of water actually in the stadium. So we have a lot of resources on our website to help you understand the link between weather and climate. That's our Climate Matters program. We also have our Coastal Risk Finder, which allows interactive maps for looking at water level. And it's a fun thing to play with. And then we have our Picturing the Future imagery, which allows you to look at places in Washington, D.C. and places around the country and around the world, and how they will look under the warming that we expect. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Dr. Pershing. Chris Williams. As president and CEO of the Anacostia Watershed Society, you are the guardian and the doctor of an important sick patient, the Anacostia River. Originally, the river was a vibrant source of food, a trade and travel route for the people of the Nacotchtank or Anacostans. Over the years, the river became a convenient dump for trash, discarded Navy Yard material, even sewage. But awareness of the potential value of the river and its environs has grown, transforming our understanding of its role not only for recreation, but also to mitigate flooding and extreme heat, as well as to sequester greenhouse gases. These are Chris Williams' seemingly impossible challenges. Chris, please join us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to the Committee of 100 for having me here today. As was said, I'm Chris Williams. I'm the president of the Anacostia Watershed Society. Our mission is to conserve and restore the Anacostia watershed, that is the river in DC, but also the entire 176 square mile watershed, for the benefit of the people who live here and for future generations. We do that in a lot of different ways, many of which I'm not going to talk about today because I've only got 10 minutes. I'm going to focus mainly on climate change and flooding issues and how a restoration agenda for the Anacostia watershed can contribute to the solutions of those problems. The Anacostia watershed and the Anacostia River are different from a trout stream you'd find in Montana. It's a river that's within an urban matrix. So when we're thinking about conserving and restoring the Anacostia River, we need to be thinking about it in terms of how do you do that within the bounds of a city and its suburbs. And when you think about it that way, you can think about not only how do you conserve that river, but how can conservation and management of that river actually contribute to the solutions to problems like flooding in an era of climate change. This is sort of a traditional map of rivers of the United States. A lot of us, when we opened up our 5th grade textbook studying rivers of the United States, this is what we saw. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. But we know a lot. We know a lot more about rivers now, and rivers don't really look like this. Rivers look more like this. Rivers are living systems that spread out across the landscape, and they're living in many ways. They're living in that they're constantly moving. Water is flowing downstream. Nutrients in the form of migratory fish and eels and that sort of thing are moving upstream, and it's a constant back and forth of energy and life. And the Anacostia is no different. The Anacostia has migratory shad and migratory eels that bring that energy from the sea back up into the river. And in turn, nutrients and sediments flow down the river to the Potomac and ultimately to the sea. Rivers naturally need room to move a little bit. They're not static like we saw on the first map, but rather based on weather conditions, based on rain or drought. They ebb and they flow. And over time, time we're used to and geologic time, they move and change. And for really good river management, that needs to be taken into account. the living, breathing, moving, roaming nature of rivers. And historically, we haven't, because of the mindset illustrated by the previous map, we haven't really thought about it that way. But we need to think of rivers more this way. And we need to think of the Anacostia River in this way. This is a map that's probably not as good as one of Dr. Pershing's maps, but it's a map of potential areas of storm surge and greater rainfall and the sort of flooding you might get. You can see the outlines of the river, which is the current flow of the river, and keep in mind that current, because it hasn't always been like this. But you can see a lot of areas, very familiar areas, particularly on the east side of the river with Poplar Point, with Anacostia Park, but also over on the west side with the Navy Yard. Again, this is just sort of illustrating on a local level what Dr. Pershing was talking about in terms of what the future might look like for some of these areas. Now, keep your eye on the banks of the river, again, the present banks of the river and the areas of potential flooding, and then look at this picture. This is the historic route of the river that has been changed. The brown lines represent where the river used to be. And the course of the river has been changed by dredge and fill and development. And they actually overlap remarkably well. The river in its original state was more prepared for climate change than it is now, certainly, but it also illustrates the potential for managing the river in a different way and managing the areas along the river in a different way that could potentially grapple with climate change. And remember what Dr. Pershing said, these rises, these sea level rises are destined to happen already. Even if we're very successful in bringing down greenhouse gases and starting to mitigate some of the temperature rises, we're still going to see this sort of flooding. So we need to be thinking about how we're going to grapple with it as we develop the city and as we think about the conservation and restoration of the Anacostia watershed. The Anacostia, as we see it today, in a place like Anacostia Park, you just walk across the grass and you get to the edge of the river and there's the river. But that's not the natural state of the Anacostia River. When Europeans arrived here, the Anacostia was a river that was accompanied by a very extensive wetlands system. Some of the remnants of some of which you can still see, particularly in the upper part of the river around the Maryland-DC line. But most of those wetlands, of course, are gone. And then behind those wetlands was an extensive forest system that held sediments in place. And when those forests were eliminated to grow tobacco and those wetlands were filled for farms and for settlement, that sediment had no place to go but into the river. And so you ended up, what used to be a 40-foot deep river became the river we have today, which is like 3 to 8 feet. So it's a very different system, a very different river system than it was 200 years ago. And one of the things in the view of the Anacostia Watershed Society that we need to do is think about how can we bring back some of that forest and wetland system that was so effective at controlling sediment and providing room for floodwaters to go in times when there were extensive rainstorms, because the wetlands act as a place where floodwaters can go and percolate into the soil and return to the groundwater rather than just flow into neighborhoods and into people's basements. So one of the things we need to consider, and there are a lot of things to consider when we're considering how to develop and restore the banks of the Anacostia River. We can't just think about climate change. We have to think about neighborhoods. We have to think about social health and welfare. We have to think about future development. But one of the things we should also be thinking about is how can we restore some of those wetlands features and some of those resilient features on the banks of the Anacostia. And there is potential to do that. This is essentially the Anacostia sort of zooming out, so you see pretty much the entire DC portion of the Anacostia. And the entire 8 miles of the Anacostia within the district are bounded by a seawall. Which is, if you ride a boat up, you can see it. It usually rises about 3 to 5 feet above the edge of the river. It was built in the early part of the 20th century. It is now pretty decrepit and falling apart, but it has the overall effect of hemming the river into into the boundaries that we created for the river over the last 200 years. There is a lot of thought going on among the federal agencies and and in the district about what's the fate of this seawall. Do we repair it? Do we remodel it? Do we take it out? And that's a perfect example of the kind of construction, development, restoration project that you can be thinking about climate change and its impacts while you're thinking about the fate of the seawall. Can we open that seawall up in some places to allow existing wetlands that are behind the seawall, as well as restored wetlands, to take on some of these floodwaters? And similarly, there are a whole variety of land use decisions that are being contemplated right now that have an impact on this. There's, I can't see my own map as there's Kenilworth Park. There's decisions being made right now about the fate of Kenilworth Park and what areas of Kenilworth Park, which was the former Kenilworth dump, what is going to be the fate of that? Right now it's grasses and ball fields that not many people use, and some areas that are pretty heavily contaminated with toxins. That area needs to be restored, but restored to what? There are some potentials for potentially some restored wetlands there, which contribute to the natural health of the Anacostia River system, and also could contribute to these flooding issues we're talking about. Similarly, at the Langston Golf Course. There's a Langston Golf Course is currently under new management, and they're working in partnership with AWS to figure out how that can become a first-class golf facility and have some room for wetlands and other habitats that could potentially lead, again, to a healthier Anacostia River and to some potential responses to flooding issues in the future. The Kingman Island, there's a ambitious restoration effort going on Kingman Island right now. And actually much of Kingman Island that isn't run by the golf course is set aside as a natural area for the district. And there are, again, opportunities there for restoration that can mitigate some of these flooding threats. There's a large planning process that's getting underway about what to do with the RFK site. And it's not just about whether you put a sports stadium there. It's about whether you take some of those parking lots and other areas that are close to the river and convert them into places where, again, floodwaters can go in the event of violent flooding. And that doesn't have to be a natural wetland, by the way, although that's one of the most effective. You can create areas which are sort of flood transparent. When the floodwaters come in, you don't use the area. When the floodwaters flow out, you clean it up a little bit and you can still use it for recreation and those sorts of purposes. Anacostia Park is going through a big reimagining process right now of what Anacostia Park, which includes not only the area in the circle, but those areas upriver and downriver as well, which they're not really thinking about just yet as part of this process. But again, a process is underway to think through how this park's going to be used in the future. Poplar Point, a similar process going on. What's going to be the future of Poplar Point? Again, one of the areas that the earlier map showed is pretty flood prone, but it's also one of the biggest, if not the biggest, undeveloped area left in DC. And so how do we manage that area in a way that restores wetlands and becomes more flood resilient? And there's talk just getting underway to completely rebuild the levee system around Joint Base Anacostia Bowling, which again presents an opportunity for how can that facility be modified and have more sort of 21st century flooding options like wetlands and flood transparent areas instead of just building a big levee around the whole base. So again, there's a lot of things, a lot of issues that need to go into, a lot of thought that needs to go into how these areas are going to be managed in the future. But one of them has to be, how can we take advantage of these areas to make the city more flood resistant in the face of these climate changes that we're all talking about today? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Mr. Dennis Chestnut, is there anything you haven't done regarding the environment and climate change. Dennis Chestnut is committed to restoring the Anacostia River, its streams and parks. As both a professional educator and strategic decision maker, he has underscored the impacts of climate change on the low-lying topography in far northeast DC, where he grew up and continues to live and work today. Dennis's work has not gone unnoticed. This past September, he received a special invitation to meet with the nation's second gentleman, Doug Emhoff, about improving parks in Ward 7. Dennis, please.
Yes, I'd like to say good afternoon to everyone. And it's really an honor to be here and get a chance to talk about something that's I'm so passionate about and near and dear to me. So far northeast Ward 7 is one of the areas in DC that happens to fall within the designated identified floodplains. The largest residential and commercial properties located within the floodplains, the 100 and 500-year floodplains here in Washington, D.C., 85% of those properties are located in far northeast Ward 7. So that puts that community right in the bullseye, or I would say the target areas, the bullseye in one way for climate impact, but it also is a target area for focus on how we adapt and mitigate in order to make sure that we're moving forward and ready to deal with the various changes that come about with that we're going to be facing with climate change. So what you see here is just a photograph that shows the possibility of what it would be if, as we saw in the earlier presentation, from sea level rise and extreme weather events, we run the risk of being impacted directly by floodwaters. So I'm presently in the process of working with a, let's see if I can, back wrong way. So I'm presently working with some community members on a project that we started 5 years ago. The project was, we were approached by the city's Department of Energy and Environment because of the location of the community. We were approached by the Department of Energy and Environment to mobilize and pull together a cross-section of community members to begin to approach how we would have impact on improving our conditions related to flood risk, but not only flood risk. And this is the interesting and important thing about this process. So it also builds capacity in the community to deal with what we refer to as any disruption. Those disruptions, of course, the most imminent are associated with flooding, but there's also other disruptions that could possibly take place. Heat is another one of those challenges. One of the reasons why it's one of the goals is to increase the tree canopy to be able to deal with some of the extreme heat conditions that we confront. And then there are other various kinds of disruptions that may not all fall within the same way, the same approaches. But the point is that when these disruptions happen and take place, there has to be a response in some form. And what we've come up with through the initial development of what we called a equity advisory group, and this was approximately 15, 20 community members that represented various cross sections of the community. And they prioritized the various challenges that the community was facing, because see, this is one of the things that a lot of times happens when the government, who works for us and, carries out our desires and things. When they come to the residents and the community members, of course, they have agendas. They have an agenda to move initiatives and things of this nature, which is not a bad thing. But a lot of times, if they haven't engaged with the community on the very, very front end, a lot of the things that are important in the community, even though they may not seem to be directly related with what that agenda is, a lot of times the community's priorities are not included. So this was a great opportunity to hear from the community, prioritize those challenges that the community is facing on a constant basis, and then be able to work with the city government and other stakeholder agencies, the federal government included, to figure out ways of approaching and dealing with the various challenges. So this equity advisory group started in 2017, and astutely, the Department of Energy and Environment, in their approach to the community, wanted this particular group meeting, this consistency of meetings, to be in the community that is impacted. So they didn't want to mobilize this group of citizens and bring them down to this wonderful place here and meet on a regular basis. They wanted to have these meetings right in the community where the people lived. That was very important as well, because I've been working throughout the city, with the city government, with the federal government, with a number of different initiatives. And one of the things that is very apparent, and has come apparent to me and to a lot of us, is that if it's not accessible for the community to be able to come out and meet and in a convenient way, a lot of times folks won't come. And especially considering thinking about transportation, the time of day that a meeting is held. A lot of times these are held in the evenings when people are beginning to do other things, getting off of work, children are getting out of school and coming home, having to prepare dinner, get the family ready for the next day. I mean, if you're talking about 6 o'clock in the evening, then you are actually cutting into people's individual and family time. So what we came up with was a process. And this process moved us to what we have developed called a Resilience Hub Community Coalition. I look forward to being able to explain that out a little further to you, but a few things that are very important about what we wound up coming up with, and this was from the recommendations from the community. First of all, we put value on the community members' time by doing something that was novel. Provide stipends to folks to be able to support, their coming out and consistently meeting in this setting. We provided childcare so that if they picked the children up from school, they could bring them along with them, and we had that covered. We provide dinner, and we even provided the dinner from local vendors. So we were supporting the local economy at the same time we were feeding these community members so that they could, be there and do the work. Plus, when you're breaking bread, you get a lot accomplished a lot of times when you're breaking bread together. And then we really made sure that we provided all of the things that was needed to be able to make this process move forward and work. So we have formed this Resilience Hub Community Coalition, but the main thing that was able to come out of this was we were able to successfully launch the first or pilot Resilience Hub. And the first Resilience Hub is located in Far Northeast Ward 7 at a facility called the Fontroy Community Enrichment Center. And it's an interesting process around how that came about. And it's also the first of what will be many We intend, our goal is to expand throughout Ward 7, especially in the areas that are under direct impact of some of these immediate challenges. But then we'd like to, our goal is to expand this and spread it throughout the city so that there will be a resilience hub within walking distance of every resident in the city over time. So thank you very much, and I look forward to answering some of your questions as we go forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chestnut. Erin Garnaas-Holmes. Thank you so much for stepping in for Miss Mary Beth DeLorenzo on her request as she has unexpectedly become ill. Erin Garnaas-Holmes is a climate program analyst in the Urban Sustainability Administration of the DC Department of Energy and Environment. By 2045, DC has committed to be carbon neutral. Like balancing a checkbook, being carbon neutral means we cannot send more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere than we remove in any given year. On unavoidably short notice, Erin, a co-worker of Mary Beth, will now undertake the daunting task of telling us what the next 20 years should be like. But before I bring Erin up to the stage here, your program contains a short biography of Mary Beth DeLorenzo. It does not contain anything about Erin because the change was just made just yesterday. I'd like to briefly provide some background for Erin. Erin Garnaas-Holmes leads climate change adaptation with the District of Columbia Department of Energy and the Environment, Urban Sustainability Administration. With a background in landscape architecture and urban planning, Erin coordinates implementation of Climate Ready DC, the district's climate change adaptation plan, and Keep Cool DC, the district's extreme heat adaptation plan. Erin has over a decade of experience working on interdisciplinary cross-sector projects to help communities become more sustainable, equitable, and resilient. Before joining the Department of Energy and Environment, Erin served as the ambassador for the Anacostia Watershed's Urban Waters Federal Partnership. Erin, please join us.
Thank you. Do you know if these mics work? I know that there's just a lot of movement in these slides. And Testing. Okay, great. So these slides still say Mary Beth DeLorenzo on there. I'm sorry that she can't be here, in part because my presence has eliminated all the gender diversity on the panel, but also because some of what I'm going to show you is my work, but all of it is her work. She's been the Urban Sustainability Administration's director for 7 or 8 years. And so she's been there for all of the district's climate change planning since the beginning. So when we're thinking about 22 years into the future, a lot can happen in 22 years. 22 years ago, I was in high school. That might not mean so much to you as it does to me. But 22 years ago, the Twin Towers in New York City were still standing. The dot-com boom was happening. Pets.com was the biggest website in the world. The bust hadn't happened yet. We didn't have smartphones. There was no Facebook. We had solar panels, speaking of climate, but they were horribly inefficient and wildly expensive. So a lot has changed in 22 years. A lot has changed in 3 years. We've had a global pandemic. 3 years ago, we had a global reckoning with racial equity that we hadn't had before. So when you're looking 22 years ahead, there's not only all of the spooky climate projections that are likely to occur, but there's a lot of social, technological, economic change that'll also happen. So before we jump into the future, let's go back to 2015 when the district started preparing for the impacts of climate change. We released Climate Ready DC, which is our plan to adapt to those changes. A few years later, we updated Sustainable DC, which is an overarching plan for the district to become more green and more equitable that includes climate targets and goals that we work towards today. And this, a year later, we updated Clean Energy DC, which has a very robust, this is our longest plan, a robust strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And then even in the past few years, we've been doing additional planning. We've developed resilient design guidelines that include ways that both buildings and landscapes like parks can start to prepare for those impacts like flooding and extreme heat. We're working on finalizing our carbon neutrality roadmap that is our goal to become carbon neutral by 2045 that Kirby mentioned. It's our strategies to get there. And just this past year in October, we released Keep Cool DC, which is our extreme heat plan. What are we going to do to not only cool down the hot asphalt streets of the district in the summer, but also keep people safe during what will become longer and hotter heat waves in the future. So that's where we are now, but let's keep the little timeline moving on the bottom and start looking into the future. So in just the next few years, something we hope to see happen is expansion of some programs we've already launched. So we just started this past year a Flood Smart Homes program where we will, for free, go to homeowners who live in those floodplains and some of those areas you've seen on the maps that are blue along the rivers along Watts Branch Stream in Ward 7. We're providing free home visits and audits of ways for people to improve their flood protection of their personal property. And depending on the strategies, we'll pay to implement those, if it's something like sump pumps or flood-proof doorways or things like that. In the next few years after that, we hope to see more and more community resilience hubs, like Mr. Chestnut mentioned. We have the pilot project in Ward 7, but we hope to expand this out so that in the next several years, there's at least one in every ward, particularly those that have the most vulnerable residents to the impacts of heat or flooding. These are facilities that are equipped to stay online during a crisis or a power outage, but during 99% of the rest of the time, they're providing services or programs that help make communities stronger, more resilient, and ready for the kind of impacts that might happen in the future. By 2030, we have a goal of seeing a 60% reduction in our greenhouse gas emissions, and we're currently on track to meet that. By 2032, we have a target of reaching 100% renewable electricity. And 100% of all of our new buildings that are constructed in the district will incorporate those resilient design guidelines so that all new buildings will be designed to withstand a future that we expect to see. And as we move closer to 22 years from now, by 2040, all new buildings, all existing buildings in the District of Columbia that are larger than 10,000 square feet, which I think includes this church here, are going to have to meet really strict energy performance standards that we have established. Currently, only really large buildings have to do this. It just started recently, but over the next decade, smaller and smaller buildings will start to be required to meet energy efficiency standards. And that might mean making big retrofits and beefing up insulation or maybe replacing certain parts of buildings' infrastructure. And we know that that can be a big burden for some buildings, particularly like affordable housing providers that aren't making large profit margins off of their building. So we have a program to provide special assistance to affordable housing to meet these standards through an accelerator program that where we provide technical assistance and the funding to meet those energy efficiency requirements. This BEPS, we call it, Building Energy Performance Standards, is crucial because something like 71% of all of our emissions in the district come from our buildings. We aren't a large state. We don't have a lot of highway transportation that's emitting greenhouse gas emissions. We don't have a lot of industrial land use. So our buildings are our largest source of emissions, heating buildings, cooling buildings, and then the life cycle sort of association of the materials that go into it, and then when we demolish buildings and replace them with different materials. So it's important for us to focus on buildings. As we get closer to the 2045 goal, we might start to see, well, we will start to see some of those climate impacts that we heard about at the beginning of the session. So I think we are projecting that by the mid-2040s, we'll see twice as many extreme heat days each summer than we do now. An extreme heat day is a day where it's over 95 degrees heat index. Our projections that we published back in 2015 for the future said that we'd have maybe 20 of those every year, and that was based on data from about 10 years ago. We already see like 35 days every year where it's over 95 degrees heat index. So we're surpassing our previous expectations. So even though we will see more extreme heat in the future, we're preparing for it. We've created a heat sensitivity exposure index that looks at not only where in the district is it going to be the hottest, or is it already? Places where there's less tree canopy coverage, more surface parking lots, more asphalt, more rooftops that are reflecting the heat. And we combine that with a map of where do the most vulnerable residents live? Where are the most elderly population? Where do people who have pre-existing conditions like asthma that make them more vulnerable to heat? And by combining those two, we get this new map that shows where are the hot spots in the district and where do the vulnerable residents live. So we're using that already to start to direct where we build more green infrastructure, where we're putting new spray parks and splash pads, things that people turn to when it's really hot outside. And so by 2043, we hope that we not only have better tools like this map, but we're preparing those communities for the impacts that they might see. And then once we hit 2045, we are confident that we'll have hit our carbon neutrality goal. We have this goal of hitting 0% emissions or carbon neutrality so that we are 100% reduced from our 2006 baseline. We have a midway goalpost that we are on track to meet. Every year we measure our emissions and report it out along with our neighboring jurisdictions in Maryland and Virginia. And through some of the programs that I showed here today and many more that are happening across district government, I feel confident that we can make our buildings more energy efficient, we can electrify what we need to reduce emissions, and we can, at the same time that we're doing all this aggressive work to reduce our impact on climate change, we can beef up the ability of our buildings, our infrastructure, and our communities to withstand the impacts that we know are already baked in, as Andy Pershing said, and that are coming. So if we live in this carbon-free future, our carbon neutrality plan has this great graphic in it that says, what does that world look like? So imagine all of these energy efficient buildings that keep you cool in the summer for barely any money at all. They're all electric. If the power does go out, they will still be able to keep you cool because they're so insulated that you don't have to worry about not having the air conditioning for a bit. We'll have an all electric bus fleet. We're already on our way towards that kind of future. All the vehicles will be electric and we won't have vehicle emissions like we used to. We'll have a whole new universe of green jobs that are created to help get to this future. And we'll have a more sort of walkable, connected city. One of the big things I think the pandemic highlighted for a lot of people was the desire to have a lot of amenities within walking distance. And so agencies like the Office of Planning and we at DOEE are trying to figure out how to create more 15-minute cities throughout the district so that people don't have to drive around to get to everything. So that's just one example of what it could look like in the next 22 years. But with all of those sort of daunting climate projections, I do think there is some hope for the future, and I'm confident that we're doing a lot of the work that we need to start to get there. Thank you.
Thank you, Erin. Your discussion of the future brings to mind a quote from the Venerable Yogi Berra, who is said once to have remarked that predictions are difficult, especially predictions about the future. We have concluded 4 presentations from experts sharing with us their experience, their knowledge, and imagine what it would be like if we could actually listen to those experts talk with each other and with you, which is the part of our program that we're moving on to now. So I would now like to invite our distinguished speakers, including Dr. Pershing, who is remote, and our chair, Shelley Repp, up to the stage to begin our conversation. Thank you. Is anybody going to? I don't think you need to worry about it.
Well, welcome everybody. It's great to see everybody here. These were great presentations. Thank you, Dr. Pershing. Though I can't see you from where I'm sitting, but we're going to have questions here. We do have a few prepared questions, but if people from the audience, and I encourage you to raise questions, you come up to the speaker here. If you don't want to do that, just raise your hand, and we'll bring a mic to anybody that needs that. So anyway, why don't we get going here? One question that I have is, we talked about resilience. What are the projects that you're working on to implement? Obviously, you're probably in the planning stage right now. But as you take to the next step, what realistic projects are there to address and have an impact?
Yes. Can everybody hear me?
Yes. Okay. Sorry. Go on, Dennis.
Yes. Can everyone hear me? Great. Well, the Resilience Hub process, as I said, it started in 2017, and okay, sorry about that. The Resilience Hub process, which started in 2017, so we've been working on this now for 5 years. And what we wound up having to do was to develop a criteria as to what would the needs be in a resilience hub. So there were, that criteria was developed, which included basically 3 basic components. A facility was very important, and understand that when we talk about a resilience hub, we're not talking about an emergency shelter per se. The Resilience Hub is actually a central location where emergency preparedness and all kinds of other programs associated with it take place, such as the primary goal right now that the primary thing that we are primarily involved with is outreach and informing and educating the community about climate change and the impacts of climate change. Because the better that the community understands what is going forward, what is associated with climate change, then the better they'll be able to respond, because they'll understand better what to do. Some of the things that are in place right now, we recently hired a program director who will take the responsibility of beginning that outreach and engagement that I spoke of. We also have the goal of developing a climate core, CORP, with a climate core, that will include both youth and adults. We've already begun with the adult populations in the community. We've trained 20 residents who have become CERT members, Community Emergency Response Team members. We also have another training that will begin later this month for another 25 Community Emergency Response Team members. So these are the kind of foundational things that we are able to begin with to begin developing out all of the programmatic work that will be underway going forward. And one big shot in the arm I would say we got was we applied for and was awarded a grant from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. This was a 3-year grant that is going to give us, that is providing us some of the resources that we'll need in order to really begin this work. So while we're in the steady state, what we call the everyday functioning, as we prepare for the disruptions as I described earlier, and then preparing for the recovery phase, or what I call personally, the bounce back phase. And as we do these things, like I said, the very most important thing for us to do is to engage with the community, bring them into this process so that they can be informed as we move forward.
Thank you. Once again, if anybody has any questions, please come up to the mic. Maybe this, Dr. Pershing to start out with. Here in DC, we're sort of an island, much bigger, country. Is it realistic to think that what we're doing here in DC is going to have a national impact?
I mean, that is always such a hard question because if climate change is just really this global problem, right? We're dealing with the emissions of, approaching 9 billion people on the planet and, all of the people who have ever lived. So the actions of any one group, it's very hard to have that, to see that difference. Where DC can really make a difference is the world looks to the United States and people in the United States look to DC for leadership. And so I found it very inspiring to hear the other speakers talk about all the great work that you all are doing, thinking about how to make a city that is, that has a lower carbon footprint, that's a more livable city, that's a safer city for dealing with flooding and for dealing with heat impacts. So I think that's really inspiring, and I think there's a lot that can be done because everybody's got to do it. Every city needs to look like the city that I think many of you are imagining, and so it's going to take a lot of work to figure that out. And I think DC has a really important role to play in figuring out how to do that.
Just run the time up here. Go to Erin. How do you add to that? I mean, would DC respond to that question?
First of all, is this working? Yes. Okay. I had a more sort of on the ground thought immediately was that from like a government perspective where we are trying to develop programs to respond to all this, we talk to other cities all the time. And just, I think next week, or maybe it's the week after, we have these sessions with the city of Austin and with the city of Los Angeles about what they're doing about extreme heat. And I think that we're all trying to coordinate with each other, both in the US and even abroad in other cities. We've talked to Buenos Aires a little bit about some of their heat issues. So I think that even if we can only make decisions within our little part of a diamond shape that only affect our so many hundreds of thousands of residents, we can set an example, and we can also learn from all of the other jurisdictions around the world that are tackling the same issues. So I don't think we have to think of ourselves as an island. I think we're one of many, and we're working really hard to work along with our global colleagues on this challenge.
Hi, my name is Sarah Green. I live in Northwest DC near Faith Wheeler. And my question, I think, is for Dr. Pershing. And that is, since you have much more of a national experience, Can you say, how does DC, having heard what DC is doing, and maybe what DC has and has not achieved, how does DC stack up against some of these other cities? Because I know everybody's trying to do something, but how do we stack up?
So I am probably not the right person to answer that. I think there are a lot of organizations that are trying to do that in terms of looking at different climate action plans and different actions. I have to say, like, the thing that really struck me from the hearing the previous speakers was the focus on heat as an issue, which I think is really rising in a lot of the national view. I think that a lot of the cities in the Mid-Atlantic are really important places to deal with that because of the high heat and humidity, and also because of the interactions between city planning and redlining and some of the historic racism that's gone on in this region. So I was just really excited to hear that come up with a couple of the speakers. The other thing I will point out, we did an analysis last year where we were looking at solar, so the deployment of solar across the country, and we did it on a state-by-state basis. And DC, even though you're not a state, probably should be, but DC came out as one of the top in terms of the solar power per, I believe it was per both per capita and per square mile. So I think that's something that you all can be proud of.
Hi, my question is for Erin of the Urban Sustainability Administration. You mentioned that 70% of the greenhouse gases, I believe, are contributed by buildings, and that demolition is one of the factors. I wonder if your agency has any input with, let's say, DEMPED and the Office of Planning and other parts of the government that oftentimes turn to demolition and rebuilding as a form of economic development or affordable housing, et cetera. Thank you.
I would say that we are certainly participating in discussions. I think that for recognizing the carbon with demolition, we also work with the private sector too. That's actually, I would say in DC, the building industry is pretty progressive. There's a lot of expertise in this region looking into better sustainable buildings and better sort of carbon neutral, net zero, whatever the leading edge is. There are people here who are experts in it. So I think that we have a Green Building Advisory Council that we turn to for learning about how much of this is possible. And the demolition issue is, I would say, not the top of the list right now. I think some of the higher topics are just how do we make big buildings, how do we make things go all electric, or how do we increase our energy efficiency in these older buildings. But it's on the list of conversations. I would say that it's probably farther down the line where we would start to see pilot projects or like regulation. I would say we have pilot projects going now, but regulations we won't see for a little while.
Hi, I have two questions, and they are for whoever wants to take a crack at them. My first question is about what are the nature of the green jobs that are going to be spun off as we become more environmentally sensitive? And are they going to be the kinds of jobs that will address the district's structural unemployment problems? And my second question is, as we go all electric, are we going to have sufficient electric generation? And how do we assure that the grid's going to be, up and running, and that we accomplish this electric future without spinning off new forms of pollution?
Yes, well, and it's very interesting in this resilience hub process that we've been working in. And for example, workforce development, I talked about the community prioritizing the things that were important to the community. And even though flooding and heat challenges were on that list, and they were actually within the top 7. But some of the top priorities included workforce development, as well as public safety, for example, food insecurity. So these were things that, you know, were higher on the priority list, and so we had to figure those things in. Some of the kinds of green jobs would include, of course, one of the fastest growing sectors is the energy sector. Solar installation, and fortunately, DC has a great great solar programs. The Department of Energy and Environment doing a great job with that. But solar generation, wind generation, as a matter of fact, the turbine installers is one of the fastest growing sectors in the whole country as far as workforce development. And then, of course, with all of the other kinds of cleanup and improvements to be made with our river, with our wetlands, with our communities, this involves jobs that, you know, are typically, someone may think of people in landscaping, but landscaping has a lot to do with stormwater management. So increasing in those kinds of sectors. And then one area that I'm personally involved with is the construction industry. Because, you know, and I work with a lot of the builders and develop these folks, they're focused, laser focused on building, getting it up. But green infrastructure is now a part of their whole conversation. So as the environmental or green sector expands, it's also inclusive of all of those other industry sectors, whether it's heating, ventilation, and air conditioning, whether it's actually the kind of materials that's going into construction, how those buildings are built to withstand the challenges as was described. So, you know, those are a lot of the ways that the workforce is included in this sector.
I just want to add one thing. One very legitimate concern you raised was, where is this energy going to come from? And is it going to create additional knock-on negative environmental effects? And actually, I think the news on that front is pretty encouraging, because solar technology and wind technology and other renewables are becoming not only more practical in terms of energy generation, but they're becoming more and more economically feasible. In the age of solar power and wind power having to be constantly subsidized by the government to make it economic and indeed profitable are ending. So I think as the need for new energy is increasing, and as the need for energy is increasing, these technologies are becoming more and more profitable and practical, and not just in generation, but also in transmission and battery storage too. So that's something that used to sort of keep me up nights a few years ago, that issue you raised. But I think that future is brightening in that regard.
We will get to everybody's involved. The paper is running a little bit late, so we'll get that. I have one question. One question for Chris.
With respect to the Anacostia, is sea level rise a bigger issue than stormwater flooding, or vice versa? What's the bigger issue?
I wouldn't categorize one as bigger than the other. They're both important. I mean, because of sea level rise, the average high tide, as you know, the Anacostia is a tidal river. It changes in depth of about 3 feet generally throughout the day as the tide comes in and out. And that high tide mark is predicted to increase another 3 feet by about 2070 under current trends. So you're going to see the Anacostia, even on a sunny day, the Anacostia is going to want more room than it has right now. And then, as Andy was talking about, we're expecting to see more frequent and more intense rainfall events, which is your stormwater issue. So the Anacostia River is going to get it from both directions, and we need to be prepared for that.
I can't get the mic here.
Hi, thank you. Rob Winthrop, I'm an environmental anthropologist. So first, compliments to all the panelists. I think these were excellent presentations. I have a comment and a question speaking to the earlier point of, does it even matter what we do in DC? It's such a huge problem. I think, so my basic comment is, excuse me, it matters a great deal. As a governance matter, the larger the scale, the more, I'll try to be polite here, the more the BS factor shapes the discussion. If you look at the UN climate change process established, I believe, in 1992, and 30 years later, carbon dioxide emissions are 60% higher than when the UN process began. And to me, the annual UN climate conferences are a farcical business celebration. You move it down to the US, governmental, national level, it's a very complex combination of a great deal of excellent technical work by agencies and a lot of political intransigence in the political sector. But when you bring it down to the local level, when you get real at the county and the city level, there really is not a lot of room for evasion. The speakers here are all accessible. They are all doing things that can be judged. Hopefully that people will join in and help accomplish, but there's not a whole lot of room for just opaqueness that makes it impossible to judge whether there are any results. So that's a long comment, and I'm sorry for its length, but the question is, as an anthropologist, I get very excited about systems that engage people not only in terms of an intellectual plan, but at a gut level. This is my land, this is where we came from, this is our place. And that's one of the things that local efforts can maximize. And I'm just one speech for all of the speakers or any, what are some techniques by which we can really frame programs and design programs in ways that maximize a sense of ownership and meaning? Thank you.
I wouldn't be surprised if we all had thoughts on that. I'll share a couple. First, to get to your comment, which I thought was excellent, and I think you're absolutely spot on. But another thing that's unique about Washington, we talked about Washington as being the capital and a very influential city, and therefore you can set great examples here. But Washington, D.C. is often a place where people convene. I work in a very local context. I work in the Anacostia Watershed, a 176 square mile watershed that is just a tiny fraction of the larger Chesapeake Bay watershed. But I spend a lot of time with groups that are traveling from other parts of the world to learn about fill in the blank, learn about river conservation, learn about climate change, adaptation, learn about community engagement. So the DC community really has an outsized impact on these issues in a lot of ways, and that's one of them. Now to your question, which again is, it's really interesting the way you frame it from an anthropological point of view. But everything that I described, all of the places I described on my map of, Kenilworth Park and Anacostia Park and Poplar Point, and all the places where there's a potential to do wetlands restoration and other interventions to try to deal with the flooding issue. These are all somebody's neighborhood. These are all where somebody lives. These are all where somebody recreates. These are all places where people take their families to have a picnic or to have some sort of outdoor event like a wedding or just a get together. And so when I'm working in these communities, my talk was very, environmentally sort of / technical focused, but a lot of the work I do is just getting to know communities, getting to know what they want and, what the future could look like for them and making sure that they have a role in creating that future. And what I've found is that these communities along the Anacostia have very sophisticated knowledge about climate change and what its impacts are going to be. and they understand the potential impacts it's going to have on their neighborhoods. They also understand the greater environmental and mental impacts, and that those need to be dealt with as well. So I have found that these communities are really strong partners in all of this work. And indeed, the solutions need to bubble up from these communities as much as from anywhere else if they're ever going to work. Let's hear it for our technical staff.
Yes, technology. Well, and I'll just go straight to the question that you answered. And actually, that is the most important component of what we're engaging in. Stakeholder, and I use the term stakeholder for a reason. Stakeholder engagement and involvement. Because you know, as we talk about these direct impacts from the challenges that we're facing, a lot of times on the other side of that are those indirect impacts, and those indirect impacts are very deeply felt within the communities where people live, work, play, because those are the things that will be lingering after you've done the initial remove the fallen trees and restored the utilities and things of this nature. Those disruptions of someone being able to go to school, go to work, be able to access food and all of these kinds of things. Those are those, I call them indirect impacts that have to be dealt with at the local level. So part of this stakeholder engagement is really getting buy-in from the community members and understanding what these challenges are so that they can be dealt with in a real focused manner.
Thank you. Once again, we'll get to everybody that's in line as of now. I don't know if we're going to be able to have time for others, but we'll get to everybody that's in line. Next.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Robert Harvey. I'm a community advocate. I advocate on behalf of the disabled, the elderly. I'm very engaged in the city, and I do a lot. And there's a lot of city council meetings coming up. And I notice all around the country, everyone is talking about 15-minute cities. And we as a people have been through a lot. So my first question would be, there'll be like 2-3 short questions, primarily Erin and I guess federal government. But how many people are advocating and coming to you all asking for 15-minute cities? Because one thing, we were campaigning for a piece of property in Ward 3. And one of the things they showed us on the development was how it's going to be green and easy and walkable space. But when you get older, you don't walk as much. So I'm just thinking that this kind of going green, you know, carbon neutral and all of that, and we're carbon-based people. That's the base of a human being. So it's couched in language. So how much of this is toward, I guess, population control, or does that tie into your, because we're growing in population. You're talking about making it a livable city, but yet and still we have an aging population. All of these things, and you're bringing people to the table, asking them to give you their opinions and ideas, and then what ends up happening in the end is the end result never feels like it comes from the community. And that's our experience, or at least my experience in being a community advocate. We'll come to you on boardrooms, we'll come to your meetings, you'll take our ideas, and it'll still go in the direction of where you would like for it to be. So I guess the primary question is there a true call for 15-minute cities all over the country, or is this just the direction the government wants to go in? Thank
you. Well, we've certainly heard people express a desire for that kind of lifestyle, but I would say that there are a lot of other things that are maybe higher on people's priority list that we've also heard. It's on the list. When we come with here's a big climate change issue. It's this giant problem in the future. Here are things we can do to get ready for it. A lot of times what we hear is like, I've got much more important stuff on my plate. I've got to put food on my plate for my children tonight. And I've got to make sure that my rent and utilities are paid. I'm not going to take an extra expense to do the extra green mile, you know, to become more sustainable if it's something that prevents me from achieving these more important needs. So I think that part of how we have to, and we've started to approach conversation about this sort of like carbon neutral future. And when we say that, all we mean is that we are, you know, not emitting carbon into the atmosphere. It's all about carbon emissions. So it's making, you know, our emissions not be releasing like pollution into the atmosphere. That's really what that's focused on. But when we're talking about those ambitious goals, we really can't be like so focused on all of the, you know, sort of like dream technologies of how we get there. It has to be rooted in people's lives. And I think that the work that we're doing, like around the Resilience Hub, is largely like that. DOEE came to form that equity advisory group that Dennis mentioned years ago and said, here's our climate change adaptation plan. Like which of the strategies in here are most important? And the group ultimately, I mean, Dennis can tell you more about it, but said, none of these, what we want is workforce development. Like we need jobs in our community. And so DOE had to be like, oh, okay, well, let's reconfigure how we've been thinking about this and instead try to invest in ways to create jobs or address what like neighborhoods are actually asking for, rather than these sort of, you know, sort of more technical and kind of like climate planning strategies that we had initially come up with, which were just a little bit detached, I'll say. So we're learning how to reconfigure how we are getting feedback on what people's priorities really are and how we invest in neighborhood priorities.
Thank you. Next.
Hi, thank you. Dan Smith. I'm from Chevrolet. I've been involved in a lot of green infrastructure and urban environmental things in the district, but recently I've been more focused in the larger area and in Prince George's, and where I think in the district government and programs has a lot more progressive and effective programs and goals than, for example, in Prince George's, where we're trying to gear up many things, but kind of bridging from some of the comments here about the projects on the ground and then the larger systemic problems overall. The Anacostia Watershed is a perfect opportunity and example to really bring these things together. We have a framework in the Anacostia Partnership, but if you're really looking at the bigger picture, it's not stepping up to the game. As Chris mentioned, you know, we should be looking at the watershed, and here it's little. It's 176 square miles, and we can't just be doing projects in the main stem without looking completely through the watershed. This is a perfect opportunity for a comprehensive approach that would affect water, heat, you know, and all these issues would come together if we could really address it on that level. And we really need, I think, some leadership out of DC, and then we need to find a way to get national leadership and support. Because, for example, in our county, even though we've had some really great improvements in planning or in our county council, just in the last election, there's really a change in attitudes for development. The development community is a juggernaut. The county has lost the most forests of any in the state. It's clearly identified coming from development. And yet the gut feeling from the leadership in the county is that investment has not come to this county. It's passed its by, and now we have an opportunity for it. Let us develop. So even though they're saying transit-oriented development, there's a lot of lip service to that, and we can point right to Chevrolet. During the pandemic, developer for Amazon warehouse came in, and the county said, fine, you can destroy 4 acres of floodplain forest and just expand the footprint This is a stone's throw from Route 50 that is flooded completely multiple times in the last 5 years. I think it's 4, maybe 5 times. Route 50 has been completely flooded by Chevrolet, requiring search and rescue teams in boats pulling people out of cars from their, the commuters. So how do we elevate this? And I think I appreciate, Dennis, we need to do the ground up, but that's not enough. We need from the top down working as well. So we need to do that pressure. So how do we get this bigger systemic approach?
Well, just briefly, the effort that's underway is both and. But one of the things that's very important and unique about what we're doing is that it's very, very focused on the local engagement. And as I described earlier, so we have, we didn't go seeking that NOAA grant. NOAA found us. NOAA saw what was happening over in far northeast Ward 7 with this resilience hub development process, and they found us. And even though it was, we had to compete against 800 other applications, they saw in what we were doing the need to make sure that they brought this to us. So it allows us to focus and work locally. And I like to use the scenario or, to describe things sometimes. It's like we're on a big airplane and the mask has dropped. And what we have to do first is put on our own mask, even though we're focused on helping the others as well. But Washington, D.C. is uniquely positioned to be the kind of example that will resonate throughout the rest of the country. So I think it's actually, we're in the process of engaging in both and at the same time.
While agreeing with everything my friend Dennis says, I have to say to you, sir, preach it, my friend. You are absolutely right. 30 plus years ago, when the Anacostia Watershed Society was founded, we didn't name ourselves the Anacostia River Society. We named ourselves the Anacostia Watershed Society in recognition of what you're just talking about, which is that the watershed as a whole needs to be restored, and you can't have a healthy river without a healthy watershed. And the DC and Maryland working in concert is vitally important. And there are bodies in place like the Leadership Council for a Cleaner Anacostia River, for example, which brings together at the county as well as the district, state level, leaders together, government, private sector, civil society, in order to try to address these problems on a watershed level. And that particular body is focused on water quality. But that example needs to be picked up so that a lot of other issues like flooding, like stormwater, need to be discussed and dealt with intergovernmentally between the governments in Maryland and DC. That's vitally important, and we're not going to have long-term success without it.
Thank you.
By the way, I'm from Chevrolet as well, so good to see you here.
Three more questions. Just keep the questions short. We have, we're over on time here, so let's keep the questions short.
Okay, thank you. We've heard from you all references to years past, conditions years past, and how they've evolved from then to now. Things that we didn't know in the past and we know now in technology and science. My question is, what is it that we do not know now that would be very useful to know for the future, for our safety and sustainability?
That'll be a good one for Dr. Pershing. So
all of you probably.
Right, echoes of Donald Rumsfeld, right? Known unknowns and, all of that stuff. I think, there are some big things we worry about in the climate system that will determine the rate of change. So we worry about tipping points in the Arctic and the Antarctic and how that may accelerate the progression of sea level rise. We worry about some tipping points in the carbon system, where right now the planet is the ecosystems are absorbing certain amounts of carbon. There are scenarios where that could reverse, and you could actually see ecosystems becoming a bigger source, and so that would be very challenging. I think the big question, though, fundamentally the big question, I think, is ultimately a social science question, and that's how quickly can people change? How quickly can we change our technology? How quickly can we change how we live? We are a species that does not like change. I think we saw that, with a lot of the resistance to different COVID measures over the last few years. And so I think that it's a real behavioral challenge that we face to get people to have climate change front and center as they're thinking about their lives, as they're thinking about their world going forward. So.
If I could add another take on that question. One of the things we really need to put a lot of thought into is, and I'm talking in terms of the Anacostia River and the health of the river vis-a-vis the city, is what does success look like? Because we know what the Anacostia looked like 250 years ago. It was in great shape, but we can't go back to that. So what is the balance to be struck between a healthy river system that not only is a healthy ecological system, but also contributes to climate resilience for the city and for Maryland, and also continues to be and is of plays a greater role in the city as a natural resource. And there's a lot of short-term and sort of obvious goals we're looking at in terms of water quality, but the sort of longer-term, comprehensive, what does success look like? I don't think we have the answer to that question right now.
Next question.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Langston Swafford. I am originally not from Washington, D.C. I'm actually from a city that's having a very similar water sea level rising climate. I'm sorry, I'm stumbling over my words. Sea level rising and climate change issue. That is New Orleans, Louisiana. I'm actually here for graduate school. I'm a master's student in public administration. And I also do community development and litter abatement and anything that's environmentally related. We're talking about the Anacostia watershed, and the first word in that phrase is Anacostia, right? So a few weeks ago, I led a community cleanup in Anacostia that focused on, oh gosh, appreciate y'all, thank you. So I led a community cleanup in Anacostia that focused on kind of the MLK Avenue corridor. And I was talking, obviously, like I said, I'm not from there here. Talked to a lot of locals who were saying that they felt forgotten, right? They feel forgotten. Not trying to be political or anything like that, because like I said, I just moved here, so I don't know any of the political climate or anything like that, but they do feel forgotten. And, we talk about climate change, and we talk about climate change mitigation and urban heat island effect and planting more trees and things of that nature. But I guess my question is, how do we keep that equitable, right? Because it seems that when we start talking about climate change and we talk about mitigation of the impacts of climate change, it seems that there's a top-down approach where there are certain communities that get more, assistance than others. I've seen that personally in my own city of New Orleans, where, if you know anything about Hurricane Katrina, the lower Ninth Ward was the most impacted, and that happened to be the highest concentration of African-American people in the city, or one of the highest concentrations. So how do we keep this change and keep this, this momentum equitable, so that way all people from Washington and the DMV area are able to reap the benefits? Thank you.
Well, I will say, and welcome to DC. I've visited New Orleans many times. Was on a panel recently with a couple of colleagues who work right now in New Orleans. And I was part of a network, ran an organization that was part of a network. And there's a organization in New Orleans called Groundwork New Orleans. Yes, absolutely. So I was the past executive director of Groundwork Anacostia River, DC. But I will say, in reference to what you're speaking of, one of the issues, and I'm out in the community, very frequently. And I was out yesterday, for example, with a family over in Far Northeast Ward 7 that is running a small farm in their neighborhood. Now, when I say a small, they're running a small farm. It was really amazing to me. And they called me because they wanted to interview me. They had seen a video or something, but I was just thoroughly impressed with what they're doing. So there's a lot of those kinds of things, grassroots kinds of things taking place. I will say over in Ward 8, the MLK area that you're talking about, there's some robust activity underway over there, and especially as it relates to what is being done in an equitable way. I mean, you have the Anacostia Coordinating Council. You have a group that actually crosses both boundaries of Ward 7 and 8 called the Anacostia Park and Community Collaborative that brings in those organizations and groups that are not traditional to the environmental space, so to speak. I mean, some of these may be, family, community serving kinds of organizations, health organizations, and so forth. So I understand, and it's great to stay focused on the equity. And one of the things that has come out recently is I think every NGO that I'm familiar with has put a forward-facing document out focusing on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that's great. But now implementing those things are really what's important at this point. So there's a lot going on. I would say, continue to search it out. We have some wonderful things going on east of the river. And one of the reasons that these things are happening the way they are, and some people may respond that way, that they feel that they're left out, they haven't been invested in. And that's understandable. But those areas over time were very self-reliant because of exactly what you're talking about, because they were under-invested in and weren't the center of focus until a lot of the development began to take place in those areas because it was an opportunity. So I would say there's a lot of robust activity underway, and the example of the Resilience Hub work that we're doing in Ward 7 is just one example of that kind of equitable work that's taking place.
Thank you. Last question here from the audience.
Batting cleanup. So hi, thank you very much for allowing one last question. My name is Mary Dolan. I'm really happy to be here. I'm the executive director of the FDR Memorial Legacy Committee, which is the Friends group for the FDR Memorial, which is here in DC, which sits on the Tidal Basin. And some of you here may have been tracking the National Park Service newly proposed seawall rehabilitation project, which is what put me into the knowledge of the Committee of 100 and the National Mall Coalition. And Judy, thank you for letting me get into this community here today. And I want to thank the committee for all of your comments as a consulting party, as well as we are as well, for the seawall rehabilitation project, which is something that is of concern to us because of where we sit on the Tidal Basin, but also our neighbor, the Martin Luther King Memorial. And so I'm just wondering, given that there is, the Park Service is a major manager of land in the district, and while a lot of this conversation, rightfully so, is talking about neighborhoods, but one of the other major things, of course, of our city here are monuments and the millions of people who come. So the question is just commentary about the work that's being done by your respective organizations, the mapping that's looking up in the sky for Dr. Pershing up there, maps that might show other areas of the Tidal Basin. You mentioned that you had a map of Lincoln, that actually you showed the map of Lincoln. So just curious about engagement on that issue of the seawall rehab. And just any thoughts about also how it might be impacting other things downriver, like the Anacostia watershed.
Well, one of the things directly related to what you were discussing with the FDR Memorial is an initiative right now that the Office of Planning in DC has underway. And memorials like the FDR Memorial are the focus of this particular initiative by the Office of Planning. So I would say actually I would direct you to go to the Office of Planning website, and you'll see this particular initiative that I'm talking about that is dealing with some of the kinds of ways that they can be reinforced and various adaptations can happen in order to mitigate some of the problems that would be associated with those challenges. Over in my community, they're even looking at where we can not just put new locations that will, draw people as far as memorial kinds of spaces, but those places that are already focuses of attention for the community, how we can enhance those in ways that they can be better serving. This was one of the conversations, fortunately, that I had with the first gentleman, and why they have this initiative to make this investment into these kinds of spaces, especially the green spaces. So, but for your specific particular question, as it relates to the memorials, I would direct you to the Office of Planning and get more information about that initiative.
I don't have like an agency official response for that, but I think that's something I think about all the time is we look at those flood maps of the future with storm surge and sea level rise, and it's basically the National Mall is the biggest blue spot on the map. And you see these sort of horrifying images of the future of the Capitol surrounded by water. But I think that, fear is paralyzing, but if you instead think of like, okay, this is happening, what's the opportunity there? At some point, the National Park Service is going to have to adapt its mission, which is currently to preserve unimpaired all these landscapes for future generations. But like the impairment is coming and the National Park Service can't stop it. So there's an opportunity maybe to rethink what, our nation's monument alley looks like that recognizes that the future is different than it's historically been. And if the water is coming, is there a way to like design it to accommodate that? The reason that that's blue on the map is that there used to be a canal that ran along with the National Mall and then down through Southwest. And so maybe the canal has to come back or something. I don't know. This isn't DOE talking. This is Erin, the landscape architect, talking. But I think that in general, I think the theme that we need to take on is that instead of looking at the future as like doom and gloom, I think our popular media loves to produce a post-apocalyptic future constantly, but we're going to be here in 2050, and it's going to be different. It's going to be hard, but humanity is going to be thriving still. And I think we instead need to think of the positive what ifs, like how do we adapt to this? How do we create something out of it rather than just standing there crying as the water comes in, and instead look at opportunities.
Well said. Well said. This is sort of in my case, this question has sort of taken this conversation full circle, because one of the first things I said in my presentation was that rivers and freshwater systems need room to roam, and that imperative is becoming even stronger in an era of climate change. The water wants to roam up into the National Mall, as Erin was just saying. So is the answer to build a wall to stop it? Maybe. But the answer might be to how do you work to accommodate that water while still preserving these monuments? That may involve some creative thinking, but it's worth thinking about. And that might actually create a mall that's potentially very different from now, but maybe even better. From my standpoint, from my organization's standpoint, we're watching this seawall restoration in the Potomac very carefully because we have our own seawall, as I mentioned, which is also largely under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service. And while our circumstances are very different than the seawall in the Potomac, I think there's a lot to be learned from that process. So while we're not directly involved in it, we're going to be watching it very carefully.
Dr. Pershing, do you have a last minute comment or a last comment on this before we close?
Well, I appreciate that these conversations are so important at the local level because it's all about trade-offs. So we have a lot of maps and tools that I think could be helpful both as as community members are trying to understand why these questions are being asked, but also for people to look at to think about what what the different futures could be. So happy to follow up with people by email if there's anything we can do to connect you with some of the maps.
Well, let's thank all our speakers, Dr. Pershing, Erin, Dennis, and Chris. Obviously, we could have kept on going, but I guess the caterer has arrived. So, right, Carol? So I want to thank everybody for coming to this Committee of 100 event. Our next event is in April. It deals with basically what we call bus garages, location of necessary necessary functions and the impact on its neighbors here. Once again, the Committee of 100, we're a welcoming organization. We would like additional members. If anybody wants to talk to me or any of the other Committee of 100 members that's here, please contact reach out to me out in the lobby. And once again, thank you to all our speakers. It was a great conversation, I think. So thank you.